Um, Hello, Professor Simon.
Who's that, Tommy?
Yeah, Tommy, I was having issue with my internet, so I just log in through my phone now.
Okay. All right, so the first chapter we're going to go over today is chapter 6, which talks about your role as an advocate. And, you've heard a lot in nursing school about how we're advocates for patients. Nurses actually advocate for a lot more than just our patients. We advocate for ourselves. We advocate for the organizations we work for, and we also advocate for nursing in general. I think of Dean Pennington. He often goes to Washington when the legislators are meeting and they're talking about higher education and nursing education, and he goes as an advocate for nursing schools. So, depending upon where you work, what your specialty is, sometimes that means talking to the lawmakers so that the profession of nursing can be advanced. You're seeing it a lot with nurse practitioners who are and have been successful at gaining autonomy. And there's things that we've had to have laws changed and passed. And in recent years, those have changed. And that's because we have nurses who are advocating for our profession. So, we think about advocating as like protecting our patients and defending what we know is right for them. But there's a lot more to that. And then, like I said, there's a lot of different aspects of our role as an advocate, especially if you become a nurse leader, because now you've got a team that you're leading. And so your unit, your teammates, everybody involved, not just nurses, but you have ancillary staff. We have to be advocating for all of that. Sometimes we're advocating for our providers. And then obviously, the patients first and foremost, but there's a lot that we really have to go into or advocate for. And it's not always easy. And sometimes it's kind of difficult waters to have to navigate in order to advocate for what we know is right and what we know is best. But when we advocate, we are obviously trying to help patients make informed decisions. Sometimes people aren't able to advocate for themselves. Think about the time we've had with COVID. There couldn't be family members at the bedside. So the people who were advocating for patients who were sedated or unaware of what was going on, the nurses is who really had to step up and advocate for what they knew what was going to be best for the patient. We intervene on their behalf. We talked about I think somebody did, when we were talking about ethics, somebody had a case study and it was involving, remember, the physician and the family member, and the family member approached the physician and said that you cannot tell, my mom that she has cancer. She won't be able to handle it. And I think it was a he says, that's fine. We won't tell her that. We'll tell her something else. It's the nurse's job to advocate for what we know is right for the patient. And so, we rely on ethics at that point, and the patient has the right to know. They're competent. They have the right to make decisions for themselves, and they can't make a valid decision if they don't have all the pieces. So if a provider is in agreement with family members to lie to a patient about something, then that's our job, that we have to step in. And we may not be able to change the provider's mind, but we have a chain of command that we can access in order to protect that patient, because patients who don't have all the information are going to make decisions, and that's not fair to them. And obviously it's very, very unethical. This talks about controlling patient choices and assisting them. So we want to advocate for them on their behalf, but we definitely don't want to dominate and control over what a patient decides. That is ultimately their decision. But what we want to do is we want to assist them by giving them the information while still making it known that this is their decision. They have the freedom to make whatever choice they want. I know with surgical patients, there were times that patients really felt that they didn't have a choice as to whether or not they should have a surgery. They weren't comfortable with it. They feel like they've been through it before, and they just had come to a time that they did not want to proceed. And so we don't want to control them or say, you have to do this, you have to move forward with it. But we want to be supportive and let them know and remind them that this is your decision. And as a patient, you have rights. And one of your rights is to choose not to move forward with something, particularly if you're not comfortable. So there's, a balancing act between advocating, not dominating, but still supporting so that they can make the best decisions for themselves. And then there's other situations where, patients won't be able to make that decision. So then we advocate on their behalf and we go through the legal channels. So maybe the healthcare proxy has all of the information that they need in order to make that decision. For areas requiring nurse-patient advocacy, these are just some of the topics where we have to be advocates. So obviously, end of life. End of life decisions are, they're not easy. And I see, Greg deals a lot with this because there are times where, and he's a provider at this point, but he's been a nurse for years. And you have patients that don't, or family members, let's say, that are the healthcare proxy. It's kind of up to their decision whether or not the patient should be made like a DNR, a do not resuscitate. And some family members lose sight of the big picture. And you have to kind of put yourself in their shoes that they have somebody they care about very deeply who isn't doing well, and they don't want to lose them. A lot of people are very, it's very difficult for them to not want to keep moving forward and exhausting any and all measures to try to help the individual. And so there are times where we have to advocate and step in and have the provider explain things to them in a way that lets them know that really everything has been exhausted and this is what's going on with the individual. And even if they survive this immediate event, there's a high likelihood that they wouldn't survive much longer, so that they can kind of step away from tunnel vision of, I just cannot lose this person, versus this is about quality of life. And what would your loved one want? What would they, if they could make this decision on their own, what would they choose to do? So we don't give our opinion ever. We don't say, well, if that were my dad, I would definitely not make him a DNR. We kind of try to navigate it so that they can just really piece apart what is the best decision for them. So end of life is always going to be a difficult conversation, and you will have patients ask you, what would you do? What would you do? Or what do you think I should do? Doesn't matter what I think you should do. It's what do you feel is right? And so that's always kind of something to bring them back to, is what would he want you to do? What would, if he could make this decision, what decision do you think he would make? Technology, provider-patient conflicts. Unfortunately, that happens more times than it should. There are often times where providers will be yelling at patients, yelling at family members, and we don't want to just allow that to happen, because now the patient has really lost trust in that provider. They feel disrespected. They're not going to want to keep seeing that provider. So we really do have to step in and advocate on their behalf. Withholding of information is like the example I gave you. If we know that the provider and the family member have decided that they're not going to tell a patient that they have cancer, that's not right. We can't let that happen. Insurance authorization, you'll unfortunately have to deal with insurance companies more times than you would care to. Medical errors. Patient grievance and appeals process. So patients have the right, just like you guys as students have the right to file a grievance against something, patients have the right to file a grievance against the organization, the facility that they're at, a particular nurse, a particular provider. Culture, ethnic diversity and sensitivity, and that is getting more attention in recent years. Respecting patient dignity. Doesn't matter how emergent the situation is, how difficult your patient is, we still have to provide patients dignity if at all possible. And that is something that they deserve as a human being. So we can't forget that. Incompetent healthcare providers. So think about, you're working on the floor and a provider shows up and you smell alcohol on their breath. You smell alcohol, they're slurring their words, they're completely out of character. how would you feel allowing that provider take care of patients that day? You know, there you have an ethical obligation to advocate for the patient and advocate for the safety of the entire organization, because they can really hurt somebody. So these are just some common examples of all the different scenarios in which patients or nurses end up advocating either on behalf of the patient, most of the time on behalf of the patient, but also of other nurses or units even. Patient rights. Patients have rights, and they will usually be posted. I know, like in our lobby, we had to post the patient's Bill of Rights. That came out in 1998 to help for patients to feel comfortable within the healthcare system. It helps to provide strength for the relationship that exists between them as a patient and their provider. But it also tells them what their responsibilities are. So it is usually legally has to be posted. So you may see it in an admissions department, a lobby, somewhere where patients are first coming into a facility. They'll often be given a piece of paper that has the patient's Bill of Rights as well. And so they have to sign that they have received a copy of it. So as a patient, you are due A, B, C, D, and E. But also as a patient, you have some responsibilities. And so it is your obligation as a patient to conduct yourself in XYZ. In 2010, the Affordable Care Act came about, and you may have heard about that. And that is regarding patients being protected when dealing with their insurance companies. This is kind of an ongoing issue in healthcare. And depending upon where you work, you'll have more exposure to dealing with insurance companies. Maybe as a patient, you've dealt with insurance companies as far as difficulty in getting things authorized or paid for. I've told you guys that I worked for a craniofacial surgeon, and she did a lot of surgery on children with congenital deformities. And it wasn't always cosmetic. If your sutures of your skull fuse too soon, it doesn't allow the brain to grow adequately, and it causes an increase in ICP. So there's health related issues associated with it. And constantly her claims would be denied in getting authorization for surgeries, and they have to go back and battle against that. So as a nurse, sometimes you're involved with advocating on behalf of what the patient needs versus sometimes what the insurance company is allowing. And most of the time that's going to fall on the provider's shoulders, because they're the ones that ultimately have to gain authorization and permission so that the bill will be paid. But they do have some protection that came out in the Affordable Care Act of 2010. The philosophy of person and family-centered care, that means that everything we do surrounds caring for our patients as well as their family. And we've talked about that now for almost a year. You know, the first person we're worried about is making sure that the patient is doing okay. But we also have to look at their support system. We have to be intervening with family. There are times, you know, think about patients who are in these terrible motor vehicle accidents or suffer a stroke. You know, these things happen very suddenly. So obviously we have to stabilize our patient, and they're our main priority. But we also have to look at the family and what does the family need? And that could be resources related to financial stuff, transportation. So we're looking at all of that, and that helps the entire patient healing process to know that all of their dynamics are being accounted for. It helps the family so that they can be involved and be supportive. And then subordinate advocacy. I've never been a fan of the word subordinate, but ultimately it is people who work underneath somebody. And as a registered nurse, there are going to be people that report to you. So subordinates could be UAPs, it could even be an LPN who are under our supervision. So nursing administrators have to advocate on behalf of our providers, and that includes the people who are underneath us, our subordinates. And so it's like you can imagine, you know, we're advocating for patients, but then when you're in a management role, now we've got to advocate on behalf of everybody. I've told you that one of the things that I dealt with a lot was labor hours. and I think we discussed this last week, labor hours and not having a good patient-nurse ratio is really a difficult thing for a nurse manager to balance, because financially it's one of the most expensive aspects of running a business is your labor. But as a nurse who works with patients, you know the importance of not having too many patients assigned to one nurse. That's when things get missed or mistakes are likely to happen. So as an administrator or a manager in nursing, we're advocating for the organization, because if you spend too much money, there will be no organization and nobody has a job. But we also know what's safe for patients, what is going to make patients the happiest and feel that they're getting the care that they deserve. And then we're advocating for our nurses who work for us in that they're maybe feeling overwhelmed. And some of you who are in healthcare are probably see this. You probably see nurses who you've had call outs, or for whatever reason, they've changed the staffing ratio, and you'll start to notice what we call like nurse burnout. And so the managers have the organization wanting them to save money and not spend too much and control their labor hours. You have nurses who feel overwhelmed, they're miserable, everybody's complaining. And then you have patients who their safety is potentially at risk. And it's just, it just takes a lot of thoughtful processes in order to organize all of those different areas. So you can imagine the responsibility that a nurse manager has. And many of you are going to enter that role probably very quickly, but you'll learn it just by working in the dynamics and watching your managers and the things that they have to deal with. But it's nice to see it from different aspects, because sometimes when we're a staff nurse, we only see it from our perspective. And that's, I'm overworked, I have too many patients, and we really have to look at the big picture. How are our patients feeling about it? What is going on with the organization and the management and what they're being tasked with as well. Nurses are at an extremely high risk for workplace violence. And depending upon where you work, you have a higher risk. So emergency departments are one of the highest. Psychiatric units, there's a high risk there, but basically anywhere that you work. And that could be from providers. We have had surgeons throw instruments across the operating room. That is workplace violence. You should never have a sharp surgical instrument thrown at you. You can have it with coworkers. You can have patients who get upset. You can have family members who get upset. We had cameras set up, and I think he was a family member, and I could see the lobby. It was closed off by locked doors, and I could see the lobby because we had the video camera. And there was an individual who was becoming kind of irate, being difficult with the nursing staff. And he was carrying a backpack, which isn't all that abnormal, but you really have to be aware of your surroundings, because we don't, at the hospital, most hospitals, there's a metal detector, or at least there is now, where they will search things like that. But when you're at a smaller facility, you typically don't see that. So you do have to be aware of what's going on. You have to be aware if somebody's becoming agitated. As a nurse, you have to de-escalate a situation while keeping yourself safe. And I don't remember all of the details about it, but the gentleman was, I think he was aggravated about having to wait for an extended period of time. He was pacing. I don't remember if he had threatened anybody, but he had this backpack. And I had gone to talk to him. Well, in that circumstance, because he had one of my nurses cornered in this room. And so he can't, one of the doors he can leave, the other two were locked. But you always want to be aware of where are you going to go if somebody starts to become upset, because your safety is the most important. But it can happen. And I was in a surgery center, so it can happen absolutely anywhere. And so you have to, just remain calm when you speak to somebody, try to figure out what is bothering them, what can we do to help the situation. If you come up and you start being super defensive, then that person can become even more aggressive towards you. And the last thing you want is to get hurt at your place of work. And we want to keep everybody else safe as well. So in a hospital, a lot of times you have access to call for security. Most emergency departments now are staffed with an officer, an armed officer, because that is the area that you're likely to receive individuals who are intoxicated, under the influence of something, mentally ill. And it can happen in individuals with none of the above. So somebody can become upset, their loved one is in the back, they may not be allowed to get back there, and then things just get out of control. I'm going to show you a video. Most of you have seen this. The volume on it is not very good. I'll turn the volume all the way up. Most of you probably have seen this. It was a nurse who was advocating for her patient and was ultimately arrested. It happened probably about 4 years ago. And this is a different type of workplace violence that can occur.
Clients share their opinion with me, and it's like, oh, wow, I didn't even think about it from that perspective. You just want to make sure that what you're talking about is legit. That's what I think.
The disturbing video comes from the inside of an emergency room, and the woman screaming, a burn unit nurse who is being arrested by a Salt Lake City police officer. Then walk. The incident, captured by police and hospital cameras, happened in July. But now the district attorney says he wants a criminal investigation.
If she doesn't, Salt Lake City Police.
University of Utah nurse Alex Wubbles says she was just doing her job, following hospital protocol by refusing to let police take a blood sample from an unconscious patient.
Is this patient under arrest?
Nope.
Wubbles says Detective Jeff Payne demanded a blood sample from a car crash victim who was in a coma and severely burned. His truck smashed by a car racing from police, according to local media. Wubbles calmly explains the policy for obtaining blood.
The three things that allow us to do that are if you have an electronic warrant, patient consent, or patient under arrest, and neither of those things, the patient can't consent.
She even gets her supervisor on the phone, who backs her up. The tension only escalates.
She's the one that has told me no. Okay. No, we're done. We're done. You're under arrest. We're done.
Salt Lake City's police chief apologized and said what happened was unacceptable.
I was alarmed by what I saw in the video. I want to be very clear. We take this very seriously.
For now, Wubbles isn't filing a lawsuit.
I feel very strongly in giving people the benefit of the doubt. And I truly believe that he was honest in his apology and sincere in his willingness to try and make change and make things better.
Police released Wubbles without charges that day after she sat in the police car for 20 minutes. Detective Payne said in a written report that his watch commander advised him to arrest the nurse for interfering with a police investigation. Payne and another officer now on administrative leave as internal investigators look into this startling incident. Dan Simon, CNN, Salt Lake City.
So what are your thoughts about that?
I remember when that happened.
I think it was 2017. It was 2017, 2018, just a few years ago. And so what was she doing?
Her job. Following the protocols of the job and like when you're allowed to take blood from a person.
So she's that patient's advocate because he was unconscious. There's nobody else there to protect that individual. And even if they are suspected of criminal activity, it doesn't matter. They still have rights, and he is a patient, criminal or not. And so the criteria is set for those instances when they can obtain blood without consent, and none of them were being met. So she was advocating for her patient. And then ultimately really became a victim of workplace violence. And in this circumstance, and this doesn't happen frequently, that law enforcement is the one causing the violence towards the nurses, but it just goes to show it can happen at any point. And she did what was right for the patient. She advocated on behalf of the patient. She may not have agreed with whatever the patient was being accused of, but that's not our job. Our job is to take care of them and advocate for them. And he was unconscious. So yeah, that was a very popular story when it occurred. I don't remember ultimately what happened at the end of the video. Obviously, it said the guy was on administrative leave or multiple people were. I don't know if they were let go from the police department. I think that was the final decision, but I'm not 100% sure. And that's a case of somebody not getting what they want at that moment and then reacting. And so you can just imagine if a law enforcement officer is capable of, you know, getting upset at something that isn't going the way that they had planned, how patients and family members, or think about maybe an instance of like domestic violence where sometimes, well, a lot of times during the assessment, the victim is in the back by themselves. And so now they've lost that control. They don't know what the person's going to say. They don't know what they're going to find. And if they're not with that individual, they can't control the situation. So a lot of times emotions can really escalate. And so we have to be aware of those different types of situations. You'll go through training for these types of circumstances. A couple of you, I think, work in the emergency department. Have you had to do anything on workplace violence as far as training?
Just did the course Monday.
Oh, you just had to do it?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and do you just like a couple of examples that were in that training?
It's like they told us, it's more of like a de-escalation class on what we do in case of like code birds or code grays, and what to do in certain situations where patients or visitors get hostile, like self-defense moves to like protect ourselves. Yeah. What's the right thing? What are the right things to say? What are the things that we should remember that's going through these patients or these people's minds? Stuff like that.
Yeah, and a big focus will be on your safety and the safety of everybody else in the facility or in that area. And you know, a lot of times we're reactive, we're human. And so when somebody verbally attacks you or says something, you know, you're busy, you're working really hard trying to do your job. And sometimes as a human, you want to react and say something back, and that can escalate a situation big time. So you have to learn what is okay to say, what is the appropriate thing to say to try to get them to calm down, because the last thing you want is for, you know, gunfire in the emergency department, or, you know, for somebody, including yourself, to get hurt. And so just always pay attention to your surroundings. This isn't even a safety chapter, but always be mindful of your surroundings. Where is the nearest place that you could exit if you have to? The last thing you want to do is get trapped somewhere and not be able to call for help or be able to leave that environment. Workplace advocacy, that is when the manager makes sure that the work environment's going to be safe, and it allows for people to have professional growth as well as personal growth. And so that's something we've talked about a few times, is that a good manager, a good leader is going to want you to grow in your profession. They want you to grow in your duties. And sometimes that means they're going to end up leaving, but that is part of our obligation, and our responsibility is to foster their growth so that they can be the best individual in their personal life as well as their professional life. There is whistleblowing. So if you're aware of something that is occurring, you can report it. And if it happens internally, obviously it's called internal whistleblowing. And that is where you report things up the chain of command. So it may be that you see a provider doing something that they're not supposed to be doing. And so you report it because you're afraid or you're fearful that they're going to end up hurting somebody or whatever it might be. External whistleblowing is when it occurs from a person outside of the organization. So I will give you an example of internal whistleblowing at my old organization that happened. It's still considered internal because it was a different department in a different state, but they noticed that there was a provider that was doing a procedure above and beyond any other provider in that same discipline. So I'm going to change it so that I don't divulge any information. But let's just say it was, I don't know, TURPs, prostate procedures, okay? And so, you know, there is a normal amount of prostate procedures that a urologist would perform. And so Medicare tracks these things so that they see, you know, Dr. Smith over here, he performs on average 78 TURPs a year. Dr. Jones, he performs about 83. And they, you know, they keep a tally of what is their population of patients and how many of these procedures. Well, if somebody is an outlier, let's say in this circumstance, it was Dr. Johnson, he was billing for 780 TURPs a year, which is well above any other provider in the area. And so somebody, I forget which department he worked in, but it had to do with either insurance or billing or contracting, but he was still within the organization. And he noticed that we had this huge outlier for a provider who was performing way more procedures than anybody else in the industry. And they notified Medicare, which is Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, CMS, which we're going to talk about in a little bit, to let them know that there could be an instance of insurance fraud occurring because of the amount of procedures that he was performing. And so an investigation occurred, and it ended up turning into this huge lawsuit. And the last entity that you want involved in a lawsuit is the government, which CMS is part of the government. And if you are involved with Medicare fraud, you will most likely probably never operate with a medical license again. So very, very serious allegations. That's an instance of internal whistleblowing. Somebody in a billing department, we'll just call it a billing department because I don't remember, noticed something is odd. They've worked in this industry for a long time, that is not normal, that they are billing for that number of procedures. And so then they whistleblow. They say that they feel that this person is responsible or it could be committing fraud. External will be somebody outside of the organization where word gets out and then it gets reported by somebody else. But sometimes, you know, nurses can be whistleblowers. So let's say if you saw a physician who was, can't even think of an example, if you see them doing something that you could end up reporting it. Now, it's not always, people don't always feel comfortable reporting such instances because then they feel that they're going to be on the receiving end of some form of repercussions. The gentleman I just told you about who reported the Medicare fraud, the company was real slick in how they did it. He ended up losing his job, but for other reasons. Technically, you're not ever supposed to lose a position due to whistleblowing. There is an anonymity component to it, but there are people who feel that they will not be trusted if they find out that it was them who reported it, and that they feel that they'll lose their job or be threatened due to whistleblowing. So a lot of people are aware of things that are happening within hospitals, within organizations, and they don't say anything because they don't want to be on the receiving end of that, which is unfortunate because that will often end in patient harm that could have been prevented. So leader managers have to be willing to advocate for whistleblowers who speak out. And it takes a lot of nerve, it takes a lot of courage. And we want to make sure that people feel comfortable that if they see something, you know, the old saying, see something, say something. If something is inappropriate or a patient or somebody can be harmed, that we want them to feel comfortable that they do need to report it, because otherwise the people who need to know aren't going to find out about it until something bad happens. We also have to advocate for the profession of nursing, and that's what I told you about Dean Pennington, you know, going to legislators and saying, you know, this is what nursing schools need. This is where we stand on certain items so that laws can be passed and the profession of nursing can be protected. And you'll see that you'll see that a lot with advanced degrees as well. We have an obligation to educate the public, and a lot of that is through the media. Nursing is seen as one of the most ethical professions that exists. And I think Joe T usually publishes the statistics on it, but we are always in like the top 3 professions that are seen by the community as being most ethical. And our communities look to nurses. They want to hear from nurses. They trust nurses. And so we do want to be involved with educating people. We want to keep their trust by doing what is right. And sometimes doing what is right is not easy, but that's how we got to where we are. And we really want to maintain the reputation that all the nurses before you have worked really hard to receive. So writing a letter to a legislator is something that anybody can do. So you want to write a letter that's personal, always be professional, always be formal in these types of communication. The letter that you write to a legislator should be concise. Don't go on this 4-page rant. They're not going to read it. You know how we talked about your resume? What do they need to know? They need to see it. It needs to be written well and concise. Same thing if you ever write a letter to a legislator, and hopefully at some point you will, about a topic that you're passionate about that benefits nursing or the profession as a whole. Always address the person by their title and establish your credibility. Remember when in your cover letter, one of the first things you're telling them was what? What's in that first paragraph of your cover letter when you're applying for a job?
That you're a nurse with your bachelor's.
Yeah, you're building credibility. I'm a graduate nurse who has earned a Bachelor of Science in nursing. So you're building credibility. So maybe you've worked in a critical care unit, or maybe whatever it is, your education, your experience, awards that we know, whatever lets them know that this is a credible person giving me insight into a situation that they're knowledgeable about. So let them know exactly what they need to know as to who you are, because that's going to go a long way with them reading the rest of your letter. If it's regarding a specific bill, refer to that bill by its number. Don't just say the bill that relates to, because that's where things can get misconstrued. You find the number, you include that. What is your stance on that issue? But then also offer your assistance. They're welcome to contact you if they want further information, if they want to look for you as a resource, that you will be available to assist them as needed regarding this issue. Sign the letter. Always make sure that your name and your contact information is there. Don't let them hunt for it, because then you're likely to not receive correspondence. It needs to be real clear. Think about the elements of your cover letter. It kind of really goes with this as well. And then be persistent. So if you had emailed your legislators and you've written to them and things just aren't going anywhere, you keep at it, and you encourage your coworkers, encourage other people to do the same, especially for those people in government who don't really know what their stance is on a topic. They're the ones that need to hear from you, because you're giving them the critical information from the person who's doing it. And these people aren't nurses. They're not in the hospitals. They don't understand what's going on. They need to hear from the ones who are having to deal with this particular situation. So you stay on them, you stay persistent, but above everything, you remain professional and polite in all of your correspondence. It doesn't matter if it's verbal or written. That's what's very, very important. As far as nurses and the media, a lot of nurses don't want to have any sort of media exposure. And sometimes that's just people are shy. They don't have the self-confidence. Maybe somebody feels they haven't been a nurse for very long, so they're not equipped to provide any feedback on a topic. But the recommendation is to take every opportunity you can to appear in the newspaper, on television, on the radio, because our communities value what we have to say. And they want to know where you stand on a topic, just like your friends and family. When you graduate, and some of you may have already been on the receiving end of this, you're going to get asked questions about everything in somebody's life. You're going to get pictures of all sorts of rashes. So-and-so fell or did this, what should I do? People want your opinions. They want your expertise. They want to know where you stand because they know you've been through the schooling and you're working these front lines. So don't be afraid to interact with the media, but there is some guidelines for interacting with the media. Always respect their deadlines. And if it's a written article, they usually need things by a specific time. So always make sure you get them the content that they need by that deadline. Try to aim for before the deadline. Assume that the reporter is going to be fair and accurate in their reporting. You don't want to go in thinking that they're going to change what you have said or make you seem as though you've said something different. We want to assume that they're going to do the best that they can and portray what our thoughts and beliefs are accurately. Have your facts ready to go. If you are being interviewed, you got to do your homework. You don't want to be put on the spot where you feel that they're going to ask you a question, you're not going to know how to answer it. You're going to have to do a little bit of investigation and have those facts ready to go. They recommend limiting your key points just to a couple. We always talk about being concise. What are the most important bullet points that you're trying to discuss? Because they're likely you're not going to get a 20-minute segment on the news. It's going to be quick, and sometimes it's less than a minute. So what are the most key pieces of information? That's what you want to discuss. Try not to speak in terms where the greater community won't understand. Just think about how you deal with patients. If you ask patients, are you experiencing any paresthesias today? They're not going to know what you're talking about unless they're medical. So think about how you're going to term certain things. Sometimes we want to come across as being highly intelligent, but then we can use terminology that nobody else but our peers understand, and that's not going to be helpful. So no jargon, technical academic jargon. Aim it for what the common person would understand while still remaining professional. Be confident in what you have to say, and always, no matter what you're doing, if you don't know the answer to something, it's okay to say that. You guys ask me questions all the time and I don't know. So you can defer to somebody else. And so if it's something where maybe the financial department at the hospital would be the best expert to answer a particular question, then you can definitely say that. You don't have to try to come up with an answer, make it seem like you know, because you don't. So it would be better if they spoke with that department. Avoid if they try to pull you into any sort of blaming of another individual. No inflammatory arguments. You really want to stay on topic. Keep clarifying what you came to talk about. Go back to those key bullet points rather than have them get you to point your finger at somebody or do that whole blame game. Because remember, it goes back to what we talked about, even in your charting. We never put blame on somebody else. Be objective, stick to the facts, stick to your key points. Because sometimes during interviews, they will try to, and if you watch the news, you can see it sometimes. They try to get things to twist just a little bit. And you've got to remain strong in, this is what I came here to do. This is what I came here to discuss, and just stick with that. So being prepared will help. Concise information is going to be best. And then just always going back to, what did you rehearse as being those 2 to 3 key elements that you want to portray or you want the people to know. I will say, so, they do encourage that you talk with the media, but I will let you know that there are times where your organization is not going to want you to discuss something that has happened. They will want you to defer to administration. I want to say, for any of you who were in Orlando around the Pulse shooting, they, especially in the beginning, because there were, a lot going on, they may not have allowed the nurses to give, because there were news people everywhere at the hospitals. They were around every corner. They wanted to interview anybody who worked in the hospital. And I can't speak for sure. But they may in those beginning stages have wanted administration to speak to the media so that only no sensitive information was getting out. We had a scenario, and I just can't remember exactly what it was, but we were told we could not talk to the media. They were likely to be out front wanting to interview, but we were to defer to the administrator and the people from corporate. So just be mindful of that as well. You wouldn't want to be divulging information about your organization if you're not allowed to. So if it's just about nursing in general, go for it. Does that make sense by not speaking about sensitive issues? Like if there's a lawsuit going on at your organization, you're probably not going to want to speak to the media at that time. So just kind of be careful and make sure that you have permission to speak on a topic, especially if it's about a particular organization. So just a side note. All right, so that's the first chapter. It's about 2 o'clock. We'll go ahead and we'll take our break till 2:10. We'll come back. We're going to look at chapter 23, and then we're going to do a case study on quality improvement. So there is potential that y'all may finish just a little bit early today. We'll see how it goes. So I'll see you back at 2:10.
Professor Simmons.
Yeah.